Sup y'all, and welcome to Global Interactions Part 7. Beginning in the 1500s, Europe found its power growing and even surpassing the wealth of Eastern Asia due to the global networks of trade they controlled around Africa and across the Atlantic. The mighty Muslim empires of Southwest and South Asia saw their power greatly reduced at the expense of Europe as their domination of the Silk and Sea roads declined. Power also shifted in Africa from the interior empires that thrived off the sand road to many coastal empires that benefited from the rapidly growing Atlantic trade routes. And so in this video, we'll investigate the end of the road. With the liberation of Istanbul in 1453, the Ottoman Turks acquired the most important trading ports between the East and the West. With their stranglehold on this territory, Europeans explored and found an all-water route to the east around the continent of Africa. While the Islamic empires would continue to flourish for more than 2 additional centuries, their demise had already been set into motion. During the coldest phases of the Little Ice Age in the mid-1600s, Europe was emerging from the destructive 30 Years' War. The Qing dynasty had just begun its reign in China, and Tokugawa Japan was almost completely isolated from the outside world. Unbeknownst to them at the time, the great Islamic Southern Asian empires, Mughal India, Safavid Persia, and the Ottoman Turks had reached the pinnacle of their power. They had long drawn strength and wealth from their control of the Silk Road and sea trade routes connecting east and west, but they declined as European countries seized control of the Atlantic as well as the Indian Ocean trade. Eventually, the lands of the Islamic empires would be ravaged by the Europeans as well. As the Muslims struggled to meet the European challenge, 2 very different responses had emerged: either westernize and modernize along European lines, or reject Western ways and restore traditional Islamic practices. Regardless, neither approach proved effective in slowing the Islamic world's political and economic deterioration. And by the end of the 18th century, the global balance of power and prosperity had clearly shifted away from the Muslim world. So, why did the Islamic empires lose their position of power to the Europeans? An empire that became fragmented and westernized was the Ottoman Empire. Now, Suleiman the Magnificent was the Ottoman Empire's greatest leader, presiding over the apex of their military, political, and economic power. He is often referred to as Suleiman the Lawgiver because he personally instituted legislative changes relating to society, education, taxation, and law. His death in 1566 marked the beginning of a long decline in power for the Ottomans. Now, a century earlier, the Ottomans had won a key victory over the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. But as European traders increasingly bypassed the Muslim-dominated land routes, the Ottoman income from trade and taxes declined. Unwilling to accept this loss of income in the 1500s, the Ottomans competed vigorously against Portugal for Indian Ocean trade. But by the beginning of the 1600s, England and the Dutch of Holland had pushed both the Portuguese and the Ottomans aside. These images show the Suleimani Mosque, built for Suleiman the Magnificent in the mid-1500s. They also showed the wonderful architecture and technological advancement the Ottomans had attained. Now, as long as the Ottomans expanded, they were able to plunder and reap great benefits from the conquered lands. They even expanded into southern Europe and were on the doorstep of some of the greatest powers in the world at that time, the Europeans. However, toward the end of the 1600s, they were defeated at Vienna by a multinational coalition of European states. This was the farthest the Ottomans would ever get, and from that point on, they experienced less wealth, more revolts, and eventually more loss of their land. Into the 1700s, they began to be referred to as the sick man of Europe because of their loss of land and power. As a multinational state, they found it too difficult and too expensive to rule absolutely. So, as the Mughals had done, they granted many leaders sovereignty over their own lands while remaining part of the Ottoman Empire. By the 1800s, the Ottomans had adopted many Western influences in weaponry, clothing, even technology. Even though they were weakened, they stabilized going into the 1800s. They may have been sick, but they were far from dead. An Islamic empire that took the opposite direction of westernizing were the Safavids of Persia. Now, Shah Abbas I ruled from 1587 to 1629 and he reconstituted a strong Persian state as a rival to the neighboring Ottoman Empire. From his capital at Isfahan, he presided over a golden age of commerce, refinement, and reform. Shah Abbas promoted the Shia form of Islam. Although he worked to make Persia more of a nation-state, he resided over a multinational empire. Nonetheless, his reign marked the height of Safavid Persia's success. His successors worked to centralize their power rather than to empower regional leaders. This, however, led to more corruption and inefficiency. Also, as more trade was diverted away from the Silk Road, the Safavids saw their wealth and power diverted as well. In the early 1700s, they lost Isfahan to the Afghans and land to the Russians and Ottomans. By the mid-1700s, the Safavids were completely conquered. The Songhai dominated West Africa, in a region mostly contained within the country of Mali today. They thrived along the Niger River, possessing the magnificent city of Timbuktu. They were a Muslim empire that began to decline as trade shifted from the Sahara to the Atlantic due to European expansion. This is similar to what happened to the Muslim empires in the Middle East. As the Europeans expanded trade to a global level, northern and western Africa declined in both political and economic importance. However, the major blow to trans-Saharan trade was the Battle of Tondibi between 1591 and 1592. This map shows the Saharan trade routes around that time. The Moroccans had repelled the Portuguese invasion at the end of the 1570s, but they had to expend great sums of money to do so, and the Moroccan economy was on the verge of collapse by 1590. In search of new resources, they turned their attention southward. An army of almost 6,000 men spent 4 months crossing the Sahara Desert and confronted a Songhai force of over 20,000 men outside of the capital of Gao. Many Moroccans were armed with arquebuses, and they even used cannons. The Songhai, on the other hand, did not have gunpowder weapons. The Songhai were soundly defeated by the much better equipped Moroccan army. They went on to sack and loot the cities of Gao, Timbuktu, and Jenne. Nonetheless, it was impractical for the Moroccans to maintain their presence in the region, and the area eventually splintered into dozens of kingdoms. With this region in shambles, the Saharan trade routes declined considerably. The economic focus had clearly shifted to the coastal regions and away from the interior. The trans-Saharan trade routes that had existed for centuries gave way to Atlantic trade of slaves, gold, and ivory for European firearms. The Islamic Mughal Empire expanded and conquered more than half of the Hindu-dominated India by the mid-1600s. It was around this time that the Taj Mahal, a mosque and tomb, was built under a Shah in memory of his wife. Now, King Philip II of Spain inherited the Portuguese crown in the late 1500s, and as a devoted Catholic, promptly closed the Portuguese port of Lisbon to Protestant shipping. Protestant nations such as Holland and England, previously content to buy their spices from Portugal, now had reason to seek their own sea routes around Africa to India. The Portuguese paid in gold, but the Dutch and the English companies wanted to create a positive balance of trade by paying in spices in exchange for manufactured goods. India neither wanted nor needed anything that they had to offer at that time. So, displaying the power of capitalism, the British East India Company got creative. Recognizing they could use calico cloth in the spice trade, the English built a textile factory on the east coast of India, paying Indian weavers in gold to make the calico. The cloth was then traded for spices. Because the labor was so cheap, the English were able to get around 300 times the spices than if they had paid for gold alone. At the same time, by using inexpensive local Indian labor, they reduced the cost of calico in the English home market and tied India more closely to England itself. The British, seeking more trade, wealth, and power, continued to expand further into Indian territory. This image shows a British fort near the city of Madras. As time progressed, the Mughals lost power to the British and their empire. They dissolved into many independent states. Now these local princes, or called nawabs, exerted control over these states. In another story, after a small battle in which British soldiers and civilians were held overnight as prisoners in a cell, the conditions were so cramped that many of them died from suffocation, heat exhaustion, and even crushing one another.
One account claimed that around 123 prisoners died out of 146 who were held. This event would be known as the Black Hole of Calcutta, and the British became even more involved in Indian affairs afterward to protect their people and to increase their wealth. The British ruled India indirectly, meaning that they would send a small number of qualified men to influence and control the Nawabs. Then they would use them to control the people. Now, this was a necessity as there was not enough qualified British men to control the vast Indian population directly, as, for example, let's say the Spanish had done in South America. By the 1700s, India was regarded as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire because it was their most lucrative possession.
Hey, guys. Oh, big gulps, huh? All right. Well, see you later.